A few days ago when I sat down on the train, opposite me was a young man with a big smile. Well, actually not a real person. It was a picture on the side of the train. But on that poster, by the side of his beaming face, were these words: "You can impact so many lives for the better." As a school officer, I get to work with young people in my community, helping them to take the right path. And he's right. The police officers do. They make an impact. And so do you. It may not be as a police officer or a schools worker, but as an ambassador of Christ and a messenger of his gospel. You make an impact every time you demonstrate some godly character. You make an impact every time you share something of the grace of God in some kind word. You make an impact as you live and share the gospel. And yet, we know that's not easy, don't we? We wonder, what should we say? We're a little bit anxious about how people might react to us. We worried what to do if they ask us a question and we don't know the answer. So how is it then that we take the joy of Sunday praise onto Monday morning? How do we take the confidence of Sunday faith onto Thursday afternoon or Friday morning on the plane? And so for a few weeks we're thinking about confidence. The confidence to live and to speak as the ambassadors of Christ. And 2 weeks ago we thought about being convinced. Convinced about God. Convinced that God holds both present and future in his hands. Convinced that God's love for us is unbreakable. And the more we are convinced of those truths, the more we will grow in confidence. Last week we thought about community. That word again, paraklesis, that journeying alongside of one another, encouraging one another, building each other up. And the more that we do that as we come together, the more confident we will have when we are scattered everywhere. Well, today we consider confidence through compassion. We're going to look at both Ebed-Melech and also at Jonathan. You see, instead of worrying what they were going to say or how people were going to react, they focused upon the compassion. They focused upon caring. They focused upon genuine friendship. Let's begin with Ebed-Melech and think about compassion and confidence. First of all, compassion hears and it takes notice. Several officials had heard Jeremiah's preaching and they didn't like it. If you submit to the Babylonians, you'll live. If you don't and you fight them, you're going to die. That's hardly the message the people wanted to hear. So they went to the king, and the king gave them permission to do what they wanted, and they dropped Jeremiah down this well. But then in verse 7, we read about another official, this man Ebed-Melech. Now he heard about it. He heard what the king had said. He heard what the officials had done. He heard what a problem Jeremiah was in. And something stirred in Ebed-Melech's heart. He didn't just keep his head down and hope that somebody else might do something. There was compassion within his heart, and compassion hears. Do we hear as we go through each day? I mean, perhaps the day is busy. We're rushing around getting the children ready for school. We jump on the bus. We rush into work. We sit down at our desk just about on time. And immediately the pressure is on. The phone begins to ring. There are a dozen emails that we need to reply. And the boss calls us into his office for a little chat. We cannot respond to every need of every person around us. But sometimes we can do something for someone if we have the heart of compassion that hears. Ebed-Melech heard, and he also showed respect. Compassion shows respect. Ebed-Melech was not happy about what had been done to Jeremiah. It was wrong. And he told that to the king. What those men have done, they have acted wickedly. But notice how he began. My lord, the king. Or perhaps your majesty. He spoke to the king with respect. And sometimes we might be in a situation in which a colleague at work is being bullied. Or perhaps our neighbour is just inconsiderate and rude. Or our children, one of them is not treated fairly in their class. Well, compassion shows respect when we speak with the child's school teacher, when we speak with our neighbour, when we talk with our boss, when the bank messes up something with our account, when we have to take something back to the shop because it wasn't in good condition. When we show respect, there's more chance that people will listen. We can't respond to every need of every person around us, but sometimes we can do something for someone when we have a heart of compassion that hears and notices things, a heart of compassion that shows respect. See also how compassion is thoughtful and practical. To pull someone out of a deep well required a lot of strength. More strength than Ebed-Melech had on his own. He needed help. So he took some men with him. But on the way to the well, they went to the temple and went into the storeroom. We might be thinking, well, what are you going to do there? Well, Ebed-Melech had gone to pick up some old clothes that somehow he knew were there. And he did that because he knew that to put ropes under Jeremiah's arms and then just heave him up could well cause either friction burns or cut into his arms and injure him. So he shouts down the well to Jeremiah, stick these clothes under your arms, between you and the ropes. How thoughtful. How sensible. How practical. And that's what compassion is. It's thoughtful and it's practical. So think with me for a moment of where you're going to be going this week. And who might you be with who needs a little compassion? A helping hand. A kind word. Do you remember a story that Audrey shared with us some years ago now? You know, the relationship with her boss at work was not easy. The boss was rather demanding and sometimes a little bit rude. And then one day, Audrey heard the boss's water bottle had broken. And as Audrey was going out for lunch, she just felt prompted by the Lord to buy a new water bottle. And so she listened. She listened to the situation. She listened to the Lord. She acted respectfully towards her boss, even when the boss was unreasonable. She acted thoughtfully and very practically. And she made an impact. The look on her boss's face was like priceless. That's compassion. Not worrying about what we're going to say or what somebody is going to do or how they're going to respond to us. But compassion recognizes need and tries to do something. Now, we can't respond to every need of every person around us. But sometimes we can do something for someone when we have a heart of compassion that is thoughtful and practical. And it's this compassion that overcomes fear. The compassion that takes notice of others around us. The compassion that is thoughtful and practical. And that compassion trumps fear. Did you ever play a game called Top Trumps? Or perhaps your children, as they were growing up, came out in the early 70s. It was a set of cards with pictures on them, perhaps of, cars or aeroplanes. And underneath the picture, there were like 4 or 5 different categories that told you something about this aeroplane. So maybe its length or its wingspan or its speed or the height at which it would fly. And for the different aeroplanes, it was different, of course. So you would share the cards out among a group of friends, and then you begin to play. The first person would look at their top card and they would choose the category that they thought was going to be unbeatable. So perhaps wingspan, because it was probably bigger than every other plane. And so when they've chosen that, everybody compares their cards, and the one who has the biggest wingspan collects all those first cards, and then the game continues. Now, some cards were likely to win most times, but there was always a category in which another card could trump it. Often for us as ambassadors, fear seems to be the biggest category. Or it seems to be several of the categories. What will people say when we say what we did at the weekend? How are people going to react when they ask us the question, why don't you swear like everybody else does? We're fearful. But compassion trumps fear. Look at Ebed-Melech. He had every reason to be afraid of saying or doing something to help Jeremiah. 4 influential, powerful men had spoken against him. The king himself had given permission for those 4 men to do what they wanted with Jeremiah. And the people didn't like Jeremiah very much either. And that's what Ebed-Melech was up against if he was going to do anything to help Jeremiah. And he could have been afraid of what the king would say, of what the officials would do, of how the people would react. But compassion overcame the fear. Fear did not paralyze him because compassion trumps fear. Ebed-Melech's focus was not so much on what the king or others might say or do. His focus was upon Jeremiah and his need and what he could do to help. Because compassion breeds confidence. When we look at the story of Jonathan and David, we see a different link. Here we see a link between friendship and confidence. And as we look at their friendship and how they supported one another, that can help us also to grow in confidence to be ambassadors of Christ in what we do and in what we say. Earlier than this, in chapter 18, we see friendship and generosity. Jonathan gave his armor and his sword and his belt to David. Now, Jonathan was the king's son, so maybe he could get another sword or belt from somewhere. But it was still an act of generosity. But Jonathan did more. He also gave David his robe. Now that seems significant to me. The king's son gives his robe to his friend. Now, I don't know if at that particular point, Jonathan knew that God had now rejected his father and had chosen David to be the next king. But if he did, then this was an act of great humility and goodwill and generosity. great generosity of spirit. There was no anger, there was no bitterness, only a generous spirit that accepted God's will and wanted the very best for his friend. And we too can show generosity of spirit in many ways when we want the best for people around us, when we celebrate their success, when we rejoice in what they achieve. Generosity is being rich with our time, rich in listening, rich just simply in being there. And when we focus on true friendship, and we're genuinely interested in others, then friendship conquers fear. We see friendship and loyalty. Jonathan was in a really difficult position as we read in chapter 20. He's the son of the king. He's Jonathan's best pal. Where will his loyalty lie? If you read on the next chapters, you'll see how loyal he remained to his father for many years, despite his father's anger and the way that he spoke to him. But here, in 1 Samuel 20, we see David's loyalty to his friend. They've pledged friendship. They made promises to each other. In verse 7, Jonathan says, I will do anything for you. So David asked him to talk with his father and let him know the outcome. Jonathan asked David to show mercy to Jonathan's family after David eventually becomes king. And so they commit themselves to keep their promises. And friendship grows where there is loyalty. Loyalty in our marriage, in our family, among our friends, in our workplace, wherever we are. Loyalty builds friendship. And when we focus on true friendship and are genuinely interested in others, then friendship conquers fear. We need to say a word about friendship and love, because the story of Jonathan and David speaks often of the love that they shared for each other. And very sadly, some try to suggest that this was a homosexual relationship. Well, there is no evidence for that in the text at all. We know that the Bible is not slow to tell us about the moral failures of women and men of faith. It doesn't for 1 second suggest that there is any moral failure in their relationships. Therefore, if the story of Jonathan and David is supposed to promote homosexuality, it's about the only place that I know of that actually therefore contradicts what the Bible teaches everywhere else. The word love that's used in this chapter is not the usual word that describes sexual love. And we must not let the 21st century worldview dictate to us what love means. Just because the world cannot conceive of a really close friendship of 2 men or 2 women without sex being involved does not mean that's the way that it was or is. Let the Bible tell us what true love is. Love doesn't envy and doesn't boast. Love is not proud or self-seeking. Love rejoices in what's true. Love protects. And love perseveres. That's love. And that's the love of true friendship. And when that love is within our hearts, then we build strong and lasting friendships. And when we focus on true friendship and are genuinely interested in others, then friendship conquers fear. And so we finish with this: friendship and courage. Jonathan was a brave soldier. He fought for king and country. He led others and inspired them to fight too. But this time was different. It was different because it involved his father. It involved his father's jealousy and anger. And it could spell real danger for Jonathan if his father got angry with him. And yet Jonathan shows great courage and bravery to overcome any fears he may have felt. He was brave to sit with his dad when David was missing. He was brave to speak with his father about David. He was brave to say, I gave him permission to go and spend the holiday with his family. And yet, probably there were many what ifs. What if my dad loses his temper? What if my dad throws his spear at me? What if my father kicks me out? What if? What if? But it was friendship. That deep, true, loving friendship that gave Jonathan the courage that overcame the what ifs. So, when we think about living as ambassadors of Christ, when we think about being messengers of his gospel, we may have certain fears. What am I supposed to say? Will people laugh? Will they think I'm stupid? Will they ask me a question I don't have the answer to? And what we need is confidence. Not arrogance, but confidence. Confidence to live as ambassadors. Confidence to speak as a messengers of the gospel. Confidence to do what is right, to say what we believe, and to share our own story of God's grace. That confidence comes when we are genuinely interested in people and when we care. That confidence comes through compassion and friendship. So may the Lord fill our hearts with his compassion. Amen. Let's stand.